Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me, and here I'll blow up the PowerPoint. So you heard Veronica say that this is kind of a part two. I'll start with an obnoxiously self-serving question to everybody in a little bit, just to kind of make sure everybody hears me, whatever. How many of you were in the session that we called quote unquote part one that took place on April 28th? Just curious. Okay, a bunch of you say yes. And to be clear, it's not required. In fact, they're a bit different. I think obviously, a lot of you were in that first one. So you might remember we called that first one the cocktail napkin session, because it was all those little notes that had been recorded on matched book covers and cocktail napkins over the last 2.5 years. And so that one happened organically, where it just wasn't planned at all. It's what emerged. You might say this is the one that was originally planned that got bumped. So that's what we're doing here today. And we're also doing it tomorrow or next week on the 25th. That is parts 2 and 3 will be more directly related to TE, probably a little bit more like what everybody expects. I'll also add the one we did a couple weeks ago. We barely made it in an hour and a half. I kind of think this one will be a little quicker, easier. So here's the overview. We started the data dive on April 28th. That's the date that I wasn't thinking of a minute ago, where we really detailed all the outcomes. There was a little bit on CAPE reporting, but quite frankly, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at TE stuff at all on April 28th. We really spent 98% of our time just reviewing those outcomes and trying to clarify outcomes, not really looking at TE reports. That said, here on May 18th, we will be looking at TE reports, and we'll be focusing on barriers and equity. I'd say quote unquote special populations is the highlight of this session. We'll be looking at some different ways to highlight special populations in TE, things like barriers to employment that we've talked a lot about, I3 and so on. And then we'll get more into performance goals next week. I'm sure a lot of you have probably participated in NRS performance goals. Some of the regular sessions, we've had lots of really good panel discussions the last few months. So it'll be that same NRS performance goals concept, but it will not be looking at NRS reports, of course, because it's a CAPE TAP webinar. It'll be looking at CAPE reports like the CAPE DIR, CAPE Summary, CAPE Program Hours Report, and so on, using those kind of things to establish goals for CAPE reporting. So the concept, just like NRS, but the particulars, of course, will be different. Okay, and then here's the agenda for today. We'll review a little bit what we discussed a couple weeks ago in Data Dive Part 1. And then here's getting into what we'll talk about today. Obviously, we'll be looking at the CAPE Summary, CAPE DIR, and an upcoming new one called CAPE Hours Report. We'll also review those consortium level reports a little bit. And then we'll get into, not sure what the right title is, but we're calling it Special Features to Isolate Priority Populations. So we'll look at barriers to employment reports. We'll look at some basic steps you can do to filter any TE report for specific subsets. The example will stick to barriers to employment, but it's not all about using it for barriers to employment. It's filtering reports for barriers to employment or pretty much any other demographics field, education level field, outcome, labor force status, you name it. You can filter, reports in a lot of different ways. So we'll look at a couple examples that will hopefully illustrate, the larger concept for lots of different ways of doing it, where we'll look at how you can filter for specific subsets. There's a new report called Nrs Ad Hoc Crosstabs. I admit the title is probably less than tantalizing, but it does allow you to kind of dial up your own report. I admit that beyond just the title being a little bit unappealing, it's also a little bit oxymoronic to use an NRS report in a CAPE presentation. But we call it what we call it because it basically looks at NRS reports and basically draws every single possible TE field under the sun that relates to NRS reporting. So we'll look at how to dial up your own reports for that. And then we've also talked about immigrant integration, or I3 reports, in a couple previous workshops. We won't cover it in nearly as much detail as we did in those workshops in March, but we do want to cover it. We really do feel like I3 relates strongly to this concept of barriers and equity, and again, and in particular, looking at special features to isolate priority presentations. So I'll mercifully move along from the agenda page. I get sorry, inquiring minds insist on knowing, does this sound more or less like what you expected to get yourselves into? I'll encourage people to say no. If that's a big time no, I really do kind of want to hear it. And I can adjust accordingly if there's any disappointed, exasperated sighs. Okay, you had no idea what you were getting yourself into. So how the heck can you complain if you didn't know what you were getting yourselves into in the first place? All right, I like that. That's an exceedingly honest answer. So we'll get moving. So we'll start with the slide that I bet you 98% of you have seen 10, 20, probably close to 50 times by now. That is the AB 104 CAPE outcome slide. Here are the 6 areas of AB 104. And again, itemizing out by category exactly which outcomes fall under each of those 6 categories of AB 104. No, I'm not going to detail this list and read them off blow by blow, but I'm just using this common slide as kind of review, because of course that's what we did in gory detail in part 1. So this is getting in a little bit, addressing it a little bit more succinctly. We talked about those ABE, ASC, and ESL outcomes, looking at things like high school credits, trying to distinguish, and identify ways of marking EL Civics co-ops and other types of outcomes you might encounter in EL Civics, other types of outcomes you might encounter in ASC. We also looked at trying to distinguish workforce preparation outcomes versus CTE, with the short answer there being if it's something short term, if it's something suggests that great progress was made, but nothing was actually completed, that suggests workforce preparation outcomes, suggests some of those CTE literacy gains we've been talking a lot about. If it's longer term in nature, if it suggests something that maybe is a finished product, then it's probably one of those post-secondary outcomes related to CTE. We went into detail related to transitions. That continues to be a really big discussion starter here lately. And then we also spent a little bit of time trying to clarify, ways of recording short-term services. So I will say we barely made it. There were a lot of outstanding questions. I probably did make a little bit of a getaway from the crime scene before everybody was able to frame me, so to speak. So I will stop here and say, hey, a lot of you were at this session. So any malingering questions, or maybe questions that weren't malingering then, but are malingering now, that you sort of looked at the material from a couple weeks ago and kind of applied it to what you're doing at your agency. I will just stop now. I guess I'll encourage you to say no if the answer is no, and then I'll know everybody is just happy-go-lucky with what happened on April 28th. And we'll stop talking about April 28th and start talking about May 18th. Okay, nothing new. So I'm going to take that as, hey, everything's hunky-dory from the last time we met. So we'll start with the CAPE summary. It's a different slide, but the same information that I know we've talked about many, many times. That is the 3 sections of the CAPE summary. Again, I'm not going to get too much into this because this should be reviewed for pretty much everybody. As I'm fond of saying, the CAPE summary is the main report you submit with end of year. It's the main report that you use to track CAPE outcomes. I like to say it's divided into 3 sections, simply left-hand section, middle section, and right-hand section. The left-hand section is literacy gains. That is the specific outcomes generated from pre and post testing. The short answer is that data is brought in directly from Federal Table 4, so it uses the same criteria as NRS federal tables use. The middle section, CAPE outcomes, includes all of the CAPE outcomes that are on the table, except those literacy gains that are accomplished through pre and post testing. So basically all outcomes except pre and post testing. The middle section requires all of those demographics and requires 12 or more hours of instruction, but it's the section that goes out of its way to exclude pre and post testing outcomes. So it also excludes the requirement for anything related to pre and post testing. And then the right-hand section is the services section. So that includes services only students. It also includes students that have some kind of affiliation with one of the 7 CAPE programs, but don't necessarily have the 12 hours of instruction or don't necessarily have all of the required demographics. If you relate to CAPE reporting, but don't meet all of those requirements for outcomes, you'll still make it on the report, but you'll fall into that right-hand services section. And I'll just add, over time, we've made more efforts. If you look at columns M and N, I should say column Mike and column November, we've tried to make better distinction between those two types of students. More on that shortly. That is, we look at the total number that qualify for that section and compare it to the number that actually receive services. So getting into this in a little bit more detail, this should be review for most of you. Again, the left-hand literacy gains section, that includes all your results from pre and post test, gains. Again, it includes information directly from Federal Table 4. Column B just gives you the number by program. Column C gives you the number in each program that completed a pre-test and completed a post-test. And then column D shows, of those that completed a pre-post pair, how many of those students made enough of a gain to complete a level on Federal Table 4. Again, this is all related to pre and post testing. Here is the middle section that relates to all of the other AB 104 CAPE outcomes. I'll start by saying, here's column F. This is probably the column here that generates most of the questions lately. Column F is the column that's new. Past I3. I3 is the cute little acronym we've used to refer to immigrant integration, say that 10 times fast, immigrant integration indicators, or I3. That's why we call it I3, I guess. So column F includes those new outcomes. I3 outcomes relate to EL Civics co-ops. More on that toward the end of the presentation, but I point that out first to show you what's new. Columns G through L, definitely not new. They had different column letters last year. Column F was other literacy gains. Column G was okay. HSD, and so on. Okay. Hello? I think so. Okay, I guess that was stray noise. So we had, different column headers before because we moved I3 into that F position, but everything other than I3, same columns as always, even though the letter designations are different. Okay, and then here's our services only. Again, it's those individuals that receive short-term services and/or those enrollees that don't meet the basic requirements for outcomes. Again, basic requirements such as demographics or 12 or more hours of instruction. We use column M to basically identify all those students by program. Column N is what we use to say, okay, of those that sort of got deposited into that right-hand section, here's the number of those that actually did receive a service. And then we have those right-hand columns for each of those different services categories. I'll add here, unprompted, getting a little bit into the weeds already, I guess you can say, that we also have this information down at the bottom where we have the not applicable. That is, you might have some students that receive services, but don't necessarily have any evidence that they relate to any CAPE program. In most situations, the students receiving services probably did other things too. So they have an entry and an update, and they have a bunch of other information. So if they do, TE will go out of its way to assign those students to a program. But as a lot of you know, we don't require any of that for services. We don't require program. We don't require demographics. We don't require anything for services other than, ID and, what you record as a service. So that number in NA are those that have services, but do not necessarily have any evidence that they're related to a CAPE program. Okay, I'll stop here. I'm transitioning. Okay, I see the note from Veronica. Hopefully that's not for me. I'll just say with that note from Veronica, and I am at kind of a convenient transition spot, let's use this opportunity as a sanity check here. Everybody hanging in there? Any questions? As usual, I'm just babbling into one overly long soliloquy. Yeah, not me. Okay, we'll take the quiz now, okay? Okay, everybody's hanging in there. That's enough. All right, so here is a new report. I've got to admit, I forgot to ask exact timeline, but I'll just say if you look right now, this will not be in TE, but it will be in TE very shortly. I'll just say as evidenced by the screenshot, there may be a few minor changes from the screenshot, but I really think the screenshot is what this report is going to end up looking like. We're calling it simply enough the CAPE Hours Report, but this is one that I at least have talked about a few different times. That is, you've heard people like Neil, I think, talk about the importance of distinguishing students with 12 or more hours versus those students that have 1 to 11 hours versus those students that have 0 hours. When we did CAPE data diving a couple years ago in person, some of you might fondly remember that was a really big issue in the previous CAPE data dive series that we did in labs, where we had a lot of activities set on having you parse out this information. That was a little bit in the absence of a simple report like this one. Now that we have a simple report like this one, hopefully this will be easier. But I'll just say you might say the burner was turned up on this because of a lot of those things that people like Neil and others have been talking about related to NOVA. With NOVA, we're all going to be required to set performance goals starting this summer. So some of those relate to, looking at these 3 buckets. That is the bucket with everybody that qualifies with 12 or more hours versus the bucket of those that have hours, but they don't have 12 versus the bucket of, those that might be services only without any hours. Well, if you have agency level access, yes, I'll just say nobody has access to this right now. Again, I'm giving you a little bit of a sneak peek here. I do think it should be available very, very soon because this is what it will look like. But I'm pretty sure everybody that tries to go into TE and looks at it at this moment is probably disappointed because it's not something that's in TE yet. But again, very soon. But I want to give everybody a preview because I really do believe this is what it's going to look like. Are there a few little wording changes or column changes that could happen? Sure. But again, this is a sneak preview that we'll use for both outcomes and services. Like you've heard people like Neil and others say here lately, there will be some required goals everybody will need to do. Some of them will be optional, but whether it's required or optional, there is a lot of language that's going to be bouncing around there related to how you're managing these 3 buckets. And it's pretty simple, I think, but a lot of it will relate to, hey, If you've got a lot of services only students, a big goal will be to move them into programs and instruction. If you have a lot of students, receiving instruction that don't have 12 hours, then there will be a lot of effort to move them to get more hours so they'll have enough hours to qualify for official CAPE reporting and obviously qualify for all those outcomes. And I'll just say thank you, Neil, for the reinforcement. That actually does make me feel like, yeah, we're on the right track here. And I'll just say, to pinpoint that reference between what you've probably heard Neil and others say and what I'll also reference that West Ed workshop from a week ago. You heard Blair and Jessica talk about this, that whole concept of participants versus adults served. That is a full-fledged participants with 12 or more hours versus merely being an adult served that makes the reporting but doesn't necessarily qualify for outcomes. Okay, I see questions for others. Sorry, I missed that somehow. Oh, butter. Okay, yeah, all right. No, that is a relevant one. I guess I'm not sure what is butterfly? I'll take that for counsel. I don't have a good example on how to set hours, but I will get the chat. I guess what I'll do is the short answer is you could do that. What I'll point out is I have examples that relate to specific student characteristics, but not hours. But there are similar steps you could probably use in TE where you filter by number of hours rather than filter by student characteristics. So I'll give you that as a clue. But that said, I'm not sure if the examples we're doing here shortly will be close enough to give you the feel. Okay, so, interesting. All right, great. 0 hours is egg, fittingly enough, the big donut, I guess, right? So anyway, I will take that for counsel, and that is a good example to consider. I'm not sure I can come up with a good example here on the fly, but I guess I do feel like I could probably take that for counsel and include an example like that in the workshop we do here a week from now on May 25th. Yes, I'm familiar with their concept, but like Diana, I hadn't heard that. I missed the butterfly analogy. So I'll take that for counsel as a good idea for an example next week. And I will point out that there's lots of ways where you can be creative in TE. The amount of filtering and sorting you can do, in my opinion, overwhelmingly and exponentially greater than any one person would ever want to do or care to do. So you can definitely run reports and filter that way. You can do things like run any report and use the navigator bar on any report setup window. And you can filter for instructional hours the same way you can filter for things like barriers to employment or student demographics and so on. Okay, hopefully there's an answer there somewhere. Okay, so here I'll just say, this does not answer your question, Paul, but this does kind of get into similar weeds like your question. I'll just say in terms of FLAVA, FLAVA, we're on the same wavelength and that we're kind of digging down is, again, we're saying it's a data dive. So I'm using this to dig deeper in the CAPE summary. Here's some common report setup window options that you may know all about. You may not know about, but I'm just sort of bringing this up as some good things you might want to consider. The one that I really bring to your attention is the one at the top called CAPE program areas. This is probably most critical for that old CAPE program hours report, but you can use this option for all of those CAPE reports that show up in those in that CAPE tables option on the TE menu. That is in CAPE land. CAPE considers ABE is basically what I think most people would consider ABE, high school diploma, and HSE all rolled into one. I'll just say CAPE considers that one program. Most of the rest of the free world considers that 3 separate programs. So because CAPE considers it one, when you go into NOVA, usually it'll adopt to the CAPE view of the world where that's all one program. So the default answer will be, it gives you that simpler NOVA format with the assumption that that's what most people want to use the reporting for. But you have the option to do like what we did in this graphic, where it itemizes it out and shows ABE, high school diploma, and high school equivalency as 3 separate rows on the report. There's another option where you can break down and have CTE all broke down, or you can roll up CTE to where it includes CTE, workforce prep, and pre-apprenticeship into one. Again, you say tomato, I say tomato here, but there are ways of doing it. Again, this will be more for next week, but when we get into things like, gee, how can we look at our data and parse it out for goal setting? This will be a really useful option, because you might want, well, ESL is not here because ESL, there's no real conflict. ESL is a standalone program for CAPE and NOVA reporting. It's done exactly the same way in TE. It's done exactly the same way in 99% of the rest of the world. So there's no conflict with ESL like there is for ABE and ASC. So there's no option in the setup window. Okay, hopefully that makes sense somehow. So that's one thing you can do here in the setup window. Again, we're digging in the weeds on purpose. Another good one to consider is down at the bottom. You can, when you're looking to drill down on the monitor, when you're looking to look at test results and drill down, the default way is it'll just show you those that already completed a level. I've got to say, most people like it the other way. You might want to check all pairs so you can see everybody that has a pre-post pair, not just the ones that made a game. Okay, again, this explains what I just said, CAPE program hours. Again, how are you breaking out CTE? How are you breaking out ABE and ASC? Again, to your question, Jared, in other programs, CAPE and the rest of the world are in sync, but again, with CTE and also with ABE-ASC, maybe not necessarily. So again, you can set it up for CAPE reporting, or you can set it up in other ways that might make a little bit more sense with most of the rest of the things you might be doing at your agency. Another, also just to clarify, I'm not sure this is as useful as it used to be, but that checkbox where it says use NOVA format for hours, just to explain what we're talking about here, is that box will be checked by default when you're running that CAPE program hours report. By default, it'll just give you that simple format that's required for NOVA. That is, these programs will be all rolled up. It's not going to worry about splitting hairs and parsing out the hours by multiple programs. It's just going to do it in the simplest manner possible, so you get the information that you can copycat directly into NOVA and wipe your hands of that requirement. But some people really want to dig deeper. They really want to see proportionally how many of those hours belong in ESL versus how many of those hours belong in career tech ed or whatever. So you can uncheck that and get the report to report those hours more complicated, if you wish to do it that way. Okay, so, moving on. I got deep there a little bit. I guess I'm going to stop here for just a minute. Any questions here? I realize I'm probably talking about way too many things at once. Everybody hanging in there, sorry. It occurs to me I should be asking this. Okay, thank you. All right, okay, thank you. All right, so anyway, I'll just say I use this to show the program hours. Again, here you can see ABE, high school diploma, and high school equivalency are shown on separate rows. CTE, workforce prep, and pre-apprenticeship shown on separate rows. Again, different ways of running it. Again, I'll reiterate the reason why I'm making such a big stinking deal about this. For one, it helps to know how to run the report. Two, when we get into goal setting related examples in the presentation next week, a real obvious way in which you might want to be able to do that is to hone in on specific programs. For example, maybe a priority at your agency and your consortium is to focus on high school diploma attainment. If that's your focus, gotta say, exceedingly good idea to be able to break down the CAPE summary and other CAPE reports to isolate those students specifically enrolled in instructional program high school diploma. If they're getting locked in with ABE or locked in with high school equivalency, I've got to say that makes your data decidedly less, interesting and decidedly less useful if it's just bundling it up like that when you're trying to use your data for that specific purpose. So if you're looking at things like that, you might find it to be a lot better to run this report the way the real world looks at instructional programs rather than looking at it the way CAPE does, that is breaking it down into more granularity by specific program. I'll just say, if you're looking at GED or high set results, that would be another example where running the report this way would probably be a much better idea than lumping all those programs into one row. Hopefully there's some sense to that somewhere with what we're talking about. Okay, and then here's the example on that CAPE program hours report. Again, this is just to let you know what I'm talking about. The simple way just gives you 2 columns. It doesn't break down all these programs, but in some cases, you might have students that are in more than one program. So if getting that level of detail is important, you can expand that to show total hours versus proportional hours and kind of see how those hours are broken down, especially if you have a lot of students enrolled in more than one program. Okay, I'll switch here to data integrity. I'm sorry I keep checking in. I feel like I'm going in too many different directions. So I'll do another sanity check, even knowing that I just did this 2 minutes ago. So everybody with me. Again, sorry, when I get in the weeds, sometimes it's hard to really see the sky. You can't see the audience, whatever. Okay, these are experienced users. Give me a break. All right, message received. Okay, so we're looking at the CAPE data integrity. I'm really just using this screenshot as a segue to wave my arms up and down and say, okay, we're not talking about the CAPE summary anymore. We're talking about data integrity, starting with a slide that many of you have seen 10 or 50 or 150 times. That is, when we look at CAPE data integrity, my line, and I've continued with it for a long time now, is to understand the DIR. Step 1 is to get a really strong understanding of that top section. If you understand what's going on in the top section of the DIR, in my opinion, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on with the bottom 80 or 90%. But if this top section titled summary information is nothing other than authentic frontier gibberish to you, most of the DIR is going to be authentic frontier gibberish as well. You want to be able to sort this out. So in review, just to help make sense, and this obnoxious number of little text boxes I have on the slide. Again, you've got the summary information. That is, there's some reconciliation that's necessary before processing all this data that's necessary to display the DIR. So as you've heard me say before, I'll use the same tired cliche too. TE likes to cast that wide net. That is that fishing analogy. We're casting that wide net. We're getting everything we possibly can get. We're really looking at getting every last fish in the sea. Again, if we get a bunch of kelp, we get a few rusty license plates, no big deal. That's going to happen. Our goal is to get everything we possibly can and basically, collect everything, so we have all the information available to start. That is the students and the services section. Any student with any relationship whatsoever to CAPE is included in that top number. So it includes the big number. You can see at the top and kind of works its way backwards. Kind of bad example. It's a little too clean for our own good, but we've got those students in the services section. Of those, there's going to be a certain number not enrolled in the CAPE programs. In this case, there's not many. We're too clean for our own good, but there's going to be 4 students that we need to eliminate because they don't really have any CAPE program enrollment. So we're going to go 1318 minus 4. Once we get the 4, and the way to see it is you can see the indentation. Students and services section at the top, indentation. Students not enrolled in the 7 programs, indentation. And then we've got those 5 rows listed there. Those correspond to each of those areas in the CAPE outcomes. So all this is doing with that extra indentation is TE taking a little extra time to smell the coffee, basically looking and saying, okay, we've got a few of these students that we're eliminating here. So while we're eliminating those students, let's kind of look at them and see if there's any good fruit there. While we're eliminating them, we're seeing, hey, again, no good examples here, but as it does it, hey, maybe a few of them earned high school diploma, maybe a few of them got a job, maybe a few of them made a transition. So if there's any of them that we're kicking out, it will note that there might be some real tasty fruit, and some of those we're kicking to the curb. It's just giving us an FYI of those that we're kicking to the curb that we might want to look at a little more carefully, because we're basically letting some good data get away, so to speak. That depends on how you do it, but that's possible you might, because again, when you proxy, obviously you then need to follow up and provide that enrollment. So if it's a test in a vacuum, it might well do that. Sometimes you might already have that program attached with the test. If so, then the test should align to some kind of CAPE program enrollment, but obviously that's not going to be true all of the time. Okay, so anyway, we're eliminating a certain number of students. So you can see 1318 minus 4 equals 1314. It's also eliminating the concurrence. So again, we arrive at 1309. Again, not a great example, but for computation sake, it's fine. So again, it's doing that reconciliation at the top. It's coming up with that number 1309 is kind of the final answer after we read everything out. So bottom line is, once it processes all that information at the top, it uses that final number, in this case 1309, as the denominator for all 27 items in that data integrity report. Again, that's important for the DIR. It needs to make sure it's calculating all 27 of those percentages consistently. The only way it can do that is by doing this reconciliation at the beginning and making sure it can apply that same denominator across all 27 items on that DIR equally. One quick aside I'll also bring up with the DIR, and this is just because it's come up a lot in the last couple weeks or so in CASAS tech support, has to do with the difference between the DIR and the CAPE summary. I'll say the more common question, quite frankly, is the difference between the NRS DIR and payment points. But that question is basically the same as one that also comes up in CAPE land, which is to ask the difference between the CAPE data integrity and the CAPE summary. The short answer is the CAPE summary or the payment points reports. Again, the exact X's and O's are a little different, but the concept is the same. For the CAPE summary reporting, just like for payment point summary for WIOA 2 agencies, those reports basically apply those basic guidelines before displaying anything on the report. That is, it has those hoops that the students need to get through in order to qualify for the report. That is, the student has all the required demographics and has 12 or more hours of instruction, CAPE summary, payment points, insist that you have all that information before it allows the students to appear on that report at all. On the other hand, the DIR is the opposite. The DIR goes out of its way to include everybody. It includes students with less than 12 hours of instruction. It includes students that are missing required demographics and so on. That's necessary because, again, part of what the DIR does is it gives you that complete number of students missing date of birth, missing 12 hours of instruction, and so on. Obviously, the only way it has a chance of calculating those totals accurately is that it includes those students with missing demographics and/or the ones that have 12 or more hours of instruction. So that was unsolicited, but that's a question that's really come up a lot here, you know, in tech support for whatever reason. So I'll just say, I think I said it last week, but I'm not sure. Probably Veronica's rolling her eyes at me now, but I'll send it to Veronica. I think I sent her a few supplemental reports. If not, I'll add it with the PowerPoint so they can have it posted on TAP. I know this is something we have posted on CASAS, but I'll send it to TAP to make sure it gets posted in the same area as this PowerPoint and the other data dive PowerPoints. But there's a relatively new cleaning up your date integrity. It's not really hot off the presses, but it was one that we updated in January, I believe. So it is up to date, and it basically includes some really gory detail information on what we've just spent, what I've spent the last 5 minutes boring you with. That is telling you column by column, row by row, what each of those means, and getting in relating column numbers to column numbers and row numbers to row numbers, really getting in the weeds and explaining what all these items mean. Okay, and then I also wanted to bring up this. This is what we talked about a lot a year ago as we were in COVID land, where the big question a year ago is, hey, we've been doing all this, now COVID's hit. What is it? What are the issues where COVID is going to be a big problem versus other areas where, quite frankly, we don't think it should really affect your data much? So these are some examples where we admit it. COVID might make your data a little funkier than usual. Obviously, 12 hours of instruction, getting people with testing at all, obviously getting people with pre-post pairs, HSC and high school diploma. Some agencies might be affected. Sometimes, you know, getting some of these outcomes, you know, having an outcome but not qualifying, you know, especially because they may not have 12 hours of instruction. Those are items that also might look a little funky this year because of COVID issues. On the other hand, there's some things that we kind of feel like shouldn't really be affected that much. All of those demographics, gender, race and ethnicity, date of birth, COVID shouldn't affect that at all. Primary, secondary goal, barriers to employment, ditto. Again, sometimes some of those earned outcomes, you know, should be kind of the same. I admit it's a little underhanded to put this one on both lists, but I gotta say, you know, it's equally likely to be affected or not, you know, depending on the circumstance. Okay, so moving along here, moving here to Consortia Manager reporting. This is a screen, well, actually it's a change of screenshot, but again, this is just showing how to do consortium level reporting. I see your point, Dana. I would encourage you to send an email if you think there are other things that would help at the consortium level. I will say we sort of sat on those three for a while. We did add a fourth one there a few months ago. The one we've added most recently is that data integrity. Up in, you know, it was just a few months ago that we added that to the Consortia Manager report menu. Here's the slide we've used for a while. That is, here's the consortium level demographic summary, just to kind of give you a taste of what consortium level reporting looks like. So again, this is the demographic summary. It's giving you really detailed information for all the different demographics. So this is just an example. We're looking at, you know, highest level of diploma. So you can see it gives you the agency ID. It gives you the number and percentage, in this case, of all the different categories under highest diploma. So again, this allows you to look at it agency by agency, as well as compare and contrast, all the different agencies in your consortium. The one little hang up, I admit, is just because of space saving. In this case, we have a really large consortium. We did that on purpose. The only way we could get it all on one page is to list by ID rather than agency name. So I admit sometimes you kind of do need to know what your own agency's IDs are. Okay, again, data diving. So here's another in the weeds screenshot here. One thing I'll bring up about, again, the consortium level CAPE summary and barriers to employment. You have two ways to do it. Again, you say tomato, I say tomato. You can run it page by page for each agency, or you can get an aggregated view. That's always the Freudian slip I make every time. Aggregated versus aggravated. Well, there you go. But anyway, you can click aggregate multiple agencies. That's what basically triggers the report's behavior. If you check that box, that will basically give you a one-page report that aggregates all of your agencies into one neat and tidy report with all of your agencies rolled into one. Or if it's unchecked, then it will give you a multiple page report. So you can look at all the different agencies in your consortium page by page. Again, kind of a you say tomato, I say tomato issue. Again, the way you govern that though is by digging deeper in the setup window and checking that box or leaving it unchecked. Okay, and then here's just proof in the pudding to show that it also includes the DIR. Here's that consortium manager view. And I'll just say we did a larger consortium on purpose. Again, you can generate it so it puts them all, you can see it's 28 pages because again, each agency is probably 2 pages per agency because it spills over. So this is giving us, about a 14 agency consortium here, 28 divided by 2. And you can see over here to the left, you can just use the navigator if you want to navigate from agency to agency to agency. Okay, I think the guided tour portion, of course, I was dishonest as usual and said this would be quicker, but I've rambled and rambled and rambled, and I've got to say it's exclusively my fault. You haven't really peppered me with many questions at all. I've just been rambling. So sorry, I was a false advertiser. All that said, I'm kind of in a transition. Is everybody hanging in? Feel free to throw the tomato can at me now if you like, because I certainly deserve it. Okay, so moving on, barriers to employment. So I'll just say, how many of you have heard people like Neil Kelly, Carolyn Zachary, Javier Romero, other state level people talk about the importance of barriers to employment, talk about how the whole world, including the state, including the feds, have really been looking a lot more carefully at barriers to employment. How many have heard that illustrious information? Okay, a few of you are willing to admit you have. Not sure if you have or you're just humoring me, but either way, I'm going to take the money and run and say, yes, of course, everybody's heard how stinking important that is. So to get everybody's foot on the rail, there are 2 reports in TE that summarize and display barriers. I think most of you know this. Even Neil has heard it. He's heard himself talking, hasn't he? And he's used a bunch of exclamation points to describe that too, I bet, hasn't he? Anyway, so I think everybody knows these reports. I'll just say, though, out of curiosity, and Rosalie, your question is perfect timing here. Are we under oath? And here's one where you really shouldn't feel bad about if it's a negative answer. I really want to hear it. But how many of you have used either the NRS barriers to employment or the CAPE barriers to employment Doesn't matter which one, you've used one or t'other. Okay, thank you, Lydia chimed in quick. Okay, mostly the chimer-inners. Okay, so go figure. The first 5 or 6 people to respond all said yes. Now everybody's saying yes as soon as I say that. But as we got past the first 5 or 6, then the no's spilled in. Okay, it looks kind of fair and balanced here. Half are saying yes, half are saying no. I've got to say that's a good ratio. That's about what I thought. But I'll just say FYI, there are 2 reports in TE that do that. These are the 2 with the menu options there for whichever, whether you again, this will be the cliche of the day. If you prefer to say tomato, you could use the top one. If you're more of a tomato person, use the bottom one. They're very similar, just so you can kind of see. The one for CAPE uses CAPE programs, like in the screenshot I'm showing you right now. And then the screenshot I showed you to introduce the topic is the NRS example. Same exact barriers, very similar, but it gives you that information by NRS level rather than by CAPE instructional program. Okay, so I'll just say with barriers, that's the quote unquote easy way. What's come up back to that obnoxious question asking about, reminding you that everybody's talking about it and so on relates a little bit to this. That is, I think in terms of collecting barriers and making sure we have barriers to attach to each and every student, and we can look at our data and show, yeah, we have lots of students with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of barriers. Everybody does a great job on that. If you run those 2 barriers to employment reports, it will verify that everybody's doing a great job on that. But when you hear state and federal level folks talk, what they're really concerned about more is looking at your data by barrier rather than looking at whether they have barriers. That is when you're looking at pre-post learning gains, when you're looking at employment data, when you're looking at transitions data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What state and federal officials want to know is, are all the students with specific barriers categories achieving outcomes at the same rate and the same level of success as everybody else? That is, are our students with disabilities getting jobs as much as all the other students are? Are our homeless students making pre-post test learning gains as adeptly as everybody else is? Are our migrant workers, transitioning the way everybody else is? Again, I'm just throwing different examples out there, but the idea is, what the feds would say is they can see that lots of local agencies and states are making progress. So they're basically turning up the heat a little bit and saying, yeah, that's great that everybody is a success story, but taking it to the next level, we want to make sure that all subsets are also doing that. I'll tie it to a lot of loftier presentations where you've heard lots of people state level talk about that concept of equity. That is, we want to be able to target special populations and be able to say that these special populations are performing great, just like our students are in the aggregate. Again, you don't necessarily always have to look at it in terms of identifying barriers categories, but I will point out that this is the main field we already have built into our data, and it is a quick and easy way to address that important concept of equity and find specific groups of students at your agency that fit that profile. If you take a little bit of an expanded view of equity to include all of these different barriers categories, my hunch is that just about any adult education agency, community college or adult ed, you're going to have at least 1 or 2 barriers that are represented very well at any adult education agency. It should be pretty easy for any agency to find a few of these categories that are relevant. It'll vary from agency to agency, but it will certainly be relevant. Okay, so sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox. I'll try to stop that. So anyway, this is just showing you how you can filter any report in TE by a specific barrier. I'll point out, you can do this by any category, not just barrier. If you're looking at other categories, the specific navigator bar option will be different. When you click that funky little funnel icon at the top of the lister, you'll get a different laundry list. If you're looking at education level, than you will if you're looking at barriers to employment. But from a mechanical point of view, the clicks will be a very similar sequence of clicking. If you're looking at filtering by barriers, refer to the report setup navigator like on the screenshot. In this specific example, barriers is included in the in-program years lister. So here you would click in-program years. That will give you the in-program years lister. You can right-click on any column to add barriers to employment. I think that was a little fix we made so you don't have to do that bottom step. But either way, in your in-program years lister, that's where you can get the barriers to employment column to appear. And you can see by clicking that little icon, that will give you the list. In this case, we check low income. That will filter the lister to show only those students who mark barrier of low income. If we filter it that way and then click generate, that will generate this particular report, but it will generate the report only for those students that have the barrier of low income. So that was a gigantic mouthful. It might have been a little too much in the weeds for a slide, but I'll just battle test it. Did anybody get any of that to stick? Yes or no? It's simple, no problem, right? Okay, sorry, I see your question. So Janae, you're wanting less clicking and more soliloquy if I read you right? Janae, I'll let you I'll say Janae, maybe you might want to unmute yourself and talk if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you. You just made a comment at the beginning of that description, and you just said that we need to look at barriers, not as something, and it was sort of separating how we should be looking at this. And I'm new to this work.
Oh no, that's a great question.
I just wanted to know if you could repeat that so that I can just get the overview.
Okay, and I will, be a little obnoxious and restate it the way I just did, that you're wanting a little bit more from the soliloquy, because I think that is the part of the presentation you're asking about. So what I said is this, sorry, I'm going to be even more obnoxious with detail, is we started collecting barriers 5 years ago when we started WIOA, new field. I gotta say, the state did a spectacularly good job responding to this field. Within a year, everybody was collecting this field. A lot of you had developed extra handouts to make sure you were reaching out to all students. So everybody's collecting this in your data. So for a couple years, that's the way we looked at barriers, is just, hey, is everybody collecting it? Is everybody dutifully adding this when they collect for every student? Yes or no? By now, I think it's safe to say just about everybody answers yes. What's come up here in the last year or two, however, is looking at barriers in a little bit more detail-oriented fashion. Instead of only looking at it in terms of, are you collecting this field as an agency, yes or no, we're looking at it by barrier. That is, we're looking at it to segment out our data to look at data from a specific barrier. So back to this example, we're using this report to filter it to include only those students with a barrier of low income. So in this case, we're looking at our data and we're kind of hypothesizing, yeah, we're doing a great job at our agency, but we admit our high income students always seem to get jobs and make learning gains. Our low income students always seem to struggle with those outcomes a lot more. So we're going to start running our CAPE summary. We're going to run outcomes reports. We're going to run NRS tables, whatever it is, to start filtering it so we can look at outcomes for just those students with a specific barrier. And at the end of the day, be able to see how those students with a barrier compare to our population overall That's what the feds have been saying for a few years. I referenced state level people are now saying exactly the same thing. That's the way we're moving, to where we're not just showing in our data that our students are doing a great job, but we can take the next step and show that students in specific learning populations are also doing a great job. Okay, thank you, Janae. Okay, so moving on to NRS Ad Hoc Crosstab. Some of you diehards that have been in that statewide TE network meeting have received some information on this report before. If you're one of those lucky warriors, you know we originally called it the NRS Ad Hoc Federal Tables Report, I believe. After we played around with it and fixed it, we changed the title to NRS Ad Hoc Crosstab. I admit the title is not that catchy, but it does very clearly illustrate exactly what the report does. It's from the federal reports menu. It's using NRS in the title simply because, as a basis for the report, what the report is doing is it's just peeling every field under the sun. That is, any field in TE that could conceivably be used for any of the 14 NRS tables is included in this ad hoc NRS crosstab. It goes out of its way to include all the CAPE specific fields as well. So it's basically a report where you can dial up your own categories and run a report of your own choosing, so to speak. So again, we're going to the federal reports menu and again, selecting ad hoc NRS crosstab. And you can see when you open it, you get to the setup window. The setup window has two really strikingly obvious features, one called row categories, another called column categories. Those two items do exactly what the title suggests. Row categories allows you to govern the rows of the report. Column categories allows you to govern the columns of the report. And basically you use those movers to basically select what you want in the x-axis versus what you want in the y column axis. Here in this one, we selected CAPE program for the x-axis. We selected barriers to employment in the y-axis. I guess we're just showing examples without the setup window. But what I'll just say here is in the setup window, we would select CAPE program. In this first example, we would select barriers to employment. We would just select row and column by selecting one field each in these two little mover features on the screen. And then here are some examples of different specific finished products that you might do, just sort of throwing out examples. So we've spent the last 15 minutes talking about barriers to employment. So I'll just say, we probably ought to use barriers as one of these examples, seeing as how we spent 15 minutes on it. So that, fittingly enough, is example number one. We're running the CAPE programs and barriers. So here's a way where you can see, by CAPE program, the number by program that has that specific barrier. Shouldn't surprise you. We've got a high number of English language learners in ESL, for example. If we're more concerned with, maybe deeper in the weeds, like homeless or migrant worker, you can see the number that show up, by barrier for each CAPE program. Again, you can get in the weeds as much as you want here. You can drill down as well. Okay, sorry. Okay, this is just another example. This one is a little bit more NRS-y, you might say. This looks at the NRS levels rather than the CAPE programs, and it's looking more specifically at MSGs on Federal Table 4. If you're, want to look at it more from an NRS point of view, this would be a better example. Here's one that's a little bit crazy level of detail, but this one is looking at all of our education results by age range. As you can see, there's no way to include all those education results and have it display as anything other than a big stinking mess There's just way too many education results to have it not be a big stinking mess. So I'm here to tell you, with some of these options, no matter what you do, 125% guaranteed, big stinking mess, exclamation point, exclamation point. There's literal, that's just the way it's going to be. So here's a good example where it's 125% big stinking mess. We've got what, 25 education results running from left to right. So you can see, good luck deciphering all of those column headers. So I'll just say what it does for you to knowing in advance that that's going to be a problem no matter, is it gives you all the education results so you can read left to right and get it all spelled out in longhand here, so you can easily figure out, you know, what all these D's are doing and what all these truncated words mean, knowing that you have no chance whatsoever at figuring that out. Okay, here's just another example, labor force status by CAPE program. Here we ran program on the y-axis instead of the x-axis. And there's 4 examples. We could give you many, 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 many more, but I've been babbling too long and false advertised and everything else. So I think we need to move on to I3 reports here. But I will stop. Any questions, anything? Sanity check. Okay, everybody's getting tired of these sanity checks. Okay, so here's the menu. Here's the demonstration, proof in the pudding, whatever. Under the TE state reports menu, that's where we have our immigrant integration indicators reports. That is right down there at the bottom. It has EL Civics in the title. There's the full-fledged name, EL Civics Immigrant Integration Indicators, EL Civics I3 Summary. Okay, starting a little bit, a little dizzy, but hanging in there. We'll talk about dizzy. We're just gonna give an eye bopper here. What's the, bell ringer here, right off the start as far as dizziness goes. Dizzy, izzy. We're gonna start with the statewide CAPE summary. I've gotta say, maybe it was dumb of me to slot this one in here right off the bat, but I wanted to do 2 things with this. One is I wanted to make the connection between these I3 reports that we're detailing here and back to that new column 3 in the CAPE summary. That is that column called past I3, where we're looking at that information from EL Civics COAPs. So number 1, this is just to consecrate that linkage. That's what we mean by I3. And when we're talking about it, is this is the information we're getting into with that new column on the CAPE summary that we've referenced a couple times already, but not really explained all that well. I'll also use this as a segue to say, when you look at the state level, last year we ran the statewide data for this particular column. And I'll just add, we had a lot of these outcomes without even knowing it that last year. That's because all of these come out of EL Civics COAPs. A lot of you, I dare say the majority of you, have been doing EL Civics COAPs for a very, very, very long time. When students pass those COAPs, it will show up as an I3 outcome. So if you're a high-performing EL Civics agency, pretty much by osmosis, you should start generating good results in this past I3 column. If you're a CAPE agency and do not do EL Civics, you don't do WIOA 2, we'll just point out you're now officially invited to start doing EL Civics COAPs. I'll get into this here as we go through these slides, but there's other people statewide at CASAS and other places statewide that are not CASAS that have done a lot of research and had a lot of discussion on this topic. And so we've now allowed you to use EL Civics COAPs. We allow you to use them for all programs, not just ESL. So if you're CAPE but not WIOA 2, that means you're CAPE but you're not EL Civics. You now have the opportunity. You're now cordially invited to the wacky world of EL Civics COAPs. That's because we've related a lot of that content in co-ops to the same content that a lot of experts and professionals in the field have identified as priority areas in the area of immigrant integration. What I'll just say is, yes, these are duplicated numbers. The I3 numbers are duplicated, just like all the other outcomes are. I'll just say I truncated this because I was really looking at I3, but because you asked, you can look at other CAPE summary screenshots for proof in the pudding. I'll just say those numbers in blue, I guess I truncate it because I really was just trying to show you I3 here, not all the gory details, but below that NA is where TE takes those steps for duplicated and unduplicated. The 116,000 is the duplicated number, the 87,000 is the unduplicated number. Kind of a tricky little sleight of hand here that's a little bit fact and a little bit circumstance, but it sure makes it easy to explain. Is I'll point out that that 87,758 unduplicated number, not far away and not far away at all, is that 87,720 in ESL. 99.999% of these outcomes from last year are all generated from California WIOA 2 EL Civics. So it really ought to be 99.9% ESL in this example. Thank goodness you can see it pretty much is. Hopefully that answers your question, Karen. So moving along here, sorry. So immigrant integration indicators gives you kind of detailed information. So here's a screenshot. It's giving you a list student by student. It's giving you that immigrant integration goal area. And then within that goal area listing the specific EL Civics passed for each student. So here's an example. We've got two students here. So again, you can see we've got two students listed. So we've got two students listed. One student has, they both covered the same 3 immigrant integration areas. Here's the one student. Here's more precise. So we've got this one student. This student has passed 5 different co-ops this year. Those 5 co-ops cover 3 different I3 goal areas. You can see a couple in the area of community, a couple in the area of digital literacy, and so on. We'll be explaining this soon. Okay, so here's I3 by class. So you can generate it at the class level, getting the same information, again, listing those specific co-ops were passed by student, and again, relating each one of those civic objectives to those goal areas. We'll be getting to more explanation here in a minute. Before we dig deep though, here's the other one of those 2 reports. We've got the EL Civics I3 Summary. This one is more of a big picture report. So here we're listing by the immigrant integration goal area. We're looking at each area and showing here by agency the total number attempted by goal area. Of those that were attempted, how many were passed, and then just the percentage, by co-op. So you can see some of these, we're doing really well, others, we have kind of a surprisingly low percentage pass. So again, we can look by co-op and use this as a good way to kind of troubleshoot. Sorry, was there a question? Okay.
No question.
Okay, so here we're just digging and showing you can drill down, highlighting that again, if you want to dig deep on that first one, I'm not sure how much drilling down there really is to do, but in the second one, I think the drill down will be very applicable. That is, you're looking at number attempted, number passed, so you can drill down and get a little bit more detail, find out which students passed, which students did it, and provide some of that EL Civics information. So here we go. Sorry, I don't know if I'll do this one again, but I should have brought this one up ahead, I guess. But here's that Ab2098 framework. So in the presentation we did in March, that was an hour and a half on nothing but I3, this recaps what allies did originally and what The AB2098 work group kind of redid a couple years ago, looking at these areas that professionals and experts in the area of immigrant immigration identified 5 to 10 years ago. In particular, that group called Allies in the Bay Area looked at this in detail, did a lot of research, came up with some core areas that they thought were the biggest priority areas in the areas of immigrant integration. Here are some of those areas. What I'll just say is some other professionals statewide did that research. What we did at CASAS is we reached out to them, they reached out to us. We partnered up a little bit, came up with the conclusion that a lot of those priority areas that were identified in the area of immigrant integration are maybe not 100% the same, but they're 98, 99% the same as the areas we've been looking at for close to 20 years in California EL Civics. So we looked at those I3 areas, matched them to the 50 or 60 EL Civics co-ops. And the short answer is we found a trend as evidenced by this chart. Here's a chart listing those I3 areas and giving you co-op numbers that relate to each of these areas. So for example, one of the key immigrant integration area is economic security, not surprising. Once we did the research, and so did they, we agreed the first 6 co-ops on the menu all relate somewhat to economic security. So if a student attempts and/or pass co-op 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, that relates to data related to economic security. You can apply, I'll do the bottom one just as another example. So we believe that co-ops 47, 48, and 73 as another example relate to digital literacy. That's another one of the important areas related to immigrant integration. So that's another example of digital literacy, right? And it started as collaboration between Allies and CASAS several years ago. Allies did a lot of this on its own. I believe Paul Downs, you're here. I know you were one of the key people from long ago, but a lot of folks, Bob Harper, Ilsa Pollitt, lots and lots and lots and lots of others did a lot of research on immigrant integration, came up with some areas that were determined to be the priority areas. And so our CASAS team looked at it and made these charts to kind of relate it. So when students pass co-ops, we feel strongly, I got to say, that when they pass co-ops, that shows that they've taken significant steps to improving, thank you, Paul, to improving areas in the name of immigrant immigration. Okay, so here's one, and I'll just say this is what we also worked on a few years ago. A couple of you have surprised me, caught me off guard, whatever, asking me for this. Most of the work, I gotta say, really focused on EL Civics, but there were some smaller, less notable efforts with this, where we also looked at outcomes and services that we already collect for CAPE reporting. So here's an example where we went through the CAPE data dictionary and highlighted some of those outcomes that are in the data dictionary that are NTE, and highlighted some of them that we felt related to that chart. So there's no report on this, but if you're interested in recording outcomes that you think are, beneficial for your immigrant students, no official credit for it, but we have kind of color-coded the data dictionary to show those priorities. If you're interested, I'll just say we did something very similar with services as illustrated by this slide, where a lot of those individual services we also thought related to a certain number of co-ops. Okay, so this one, I'm not going to go step by step, but it's one of those things where if I don't include it, I'm remiss. So if you are one of those agencies that has not been doing EL Civics over the years, obviously the learning curve for getting co-ops in is difficult. So here's the slide that shows you how to manually enter COAPs and TE. If you're an EL Civics agency, this is no big deal. But if you haven't been doing EL Civics, I admit, not intuitive. Here are the detail-oriented directions. I'll just say probably too little too late now, but I'll just say this is directly from a webinar we did in March, which hopefully was a little bit better in terms of bringing this up for people that wanted to get started. And so I'll just say, if you are one of those agencies that's getting started with this and you're in that, oddball position where you're manually entering this and you're kind of fumbling your way around, what I will just say is, I don't know if it helps or not, but when you're manually entering COAPs, this for my 2 cents is the issue that's kind of the number 1, number 2, and number 3, most problematic, most confusing issue is when you do this, you're basically going into the test lister and creating a new test, only you're not creating a new test, you're creating a new additional assessment. So what you need to do is most of the time when you're doing this, you are doing a test manually. In this example, though, of course, you're doing an additional assessment. So it's really, really, really important to go in and change the assessment type from fixed form, which is the TE term for pre and post form, to EL Civics additional assessment form. That's what allows you to parlay it from regular pre or post test form to EL Civics form. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. 404. What's 404? I'm not sure. Where did we 404? Sounds like the room number for the Human Resources Department, doesn't it? Anyway, so here is a preview of next week. For 525, that's a week from now, we'll get into goal setting. A lot of what we've talked about, I gotta say, yeah, it's 1 digit away from the LA parking lot. What I'll just say is a lot of this session and next session relate to each other a lot more closely than this one does to the one we did a couple weeks ago. We'll use a lot of this information related to CAPE Summary, CAPE Hours, and CAPE DIR to get more specifically into goal setting. I'll make note, we'll have an hours related example. That's a good example. A couple of you have given me some other examples. We'll try to do that, but we'll basically look at the idea of goal setting. We'll incorporate some of those NRS performance goals examples we've talked about in many other NRS We Owe It To workshops. And then we'll try to, take a stab at sticking that chocolate bar into the jar of peanut butter, where we'll use that NRS performance goals concept and apply that to CAPE reporting and give you more CAPE-y sort of results. The same sort of results we talk about a lot when we look at the CASAS data portal and NRS performance goals, but instead of providing those kind of examples that are great for NRS or not so great for CAPE, we'll use examples related to things like the CAPE summary. We'll, of course, try to focus on, what barriers do an example, an I3 example also, to make sure it relates well to, what's going on with both workshops. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah. So I'll just say I am finished. Any questions? Anybody with any gunshots you need to fire my way? You've been waiting all this time. You've got a couple minutes to. I won't be able to get away. You can shoot me now if you want. I'll turn it over to Mandalee, Veronica, Holly. Not sure which one of you is taking over.
Thank you, Jay. And I don't see any questions. I'm checking the. Oh, it looks like Neil has one. Can a non-ELL student enroll in a COAP?
Yes, I did mention that, but yeah, I was talking about that with a million other things at once. That's the difference between CAPE and California EL Civics. Most of you are EL Civics. You already know If they're not in ESL, forget it. Those EL Civics co-ops and all other EL Civics only count for learners enrolled in ESL. For CAPE reporting, you know, that's a discussion that's been had several times at the state level. Everybody believes, come on, immigrants can be from all programs, not just ESL. So thereby I3 outcomes apply to all programs, not just ESL. So likewise, if you're a non-WIOA agency in CAPE and you want to get started on this, this might be an invitation. Similarly, if you've been doing EL Civics all this time and you've kind of been itching to want this to apply for ASE or ABE or Career Tech Ed or whatever, here's your golden opportunity. Thank you. That's a good question to bring up. Thank you.
Okay, and I think those are all of the questions. If anyone has any last questions, definitely feel free to post them in the chat. Also in the chat, Medley has posted a number of links, including the evaluation link. We just transitioned to a new registration site, and so the links are a little different, so our apologies for any confusion, but the evaluation link is in the email, as well as links to our upcoming webinars. So the one, Wested originally had a webinar scheduled for tomorrow on CV21. That webinar has been postponed, and so you will be receiving communication about that, and we will also send communication once a new date has been set, as well as automatically register anyone who had previously registered for tomorrow's webinar. So be on the lookout for additional information regarding the rescheduling of that particular webinar. We also have one on Friday, which is another one of our CAP Deeper Dive State Priority webinars. And this one is going to be based on the State Priority Program Development. And the topic for Friday's webinar will be on California adult education's role in California's economic recovery. And our presenters are Jenny Malika and Peter Simon. And they have also invited panelists from the CARET Consortium, the Glendale Learns Consortium, as well as the Sonoma Consortium. So you'll be able to hear about practitioners' experience as they are preparing for California's economic recovery through adult education. And then we'll be back next Tuesday with Jay for the third part of his data dive series. And then later on this month, as it was mentioned in the chat, there will be a webinar on member effectiveness and the processes and plans that will be implemented as of July 1. And that will be with Neil Kelly and Dr. Carolyn Zachary of the CAP office, as well as Costas and CAP TAP. Registration for that webinar will be released tomorrow with the newsletter. So you'll be able to register at that particular time. If you are currently not subscribed to the newsletter, we definitely invite you to subscribe to the newsletter, because that's where we send out communication regarding all things CAP. And that's kind of your first point of information, as well as the Calado Ed website. So if you aren't subscribed, I would definitely invite you to subscribe so that you don't miss out on any pertinent information related to CEP. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with the evaluation link, as well as the recording and a link to the PowerPoint presentation. Again, please use that for future reference, as well as share with others who may have not been able to participate in today's webinar, and they would like to learn about this information as well. So again, I'm checking the chat and I don't see any additional information, any additional questions. But again, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to contact TAP or even Costas, and we will be able to provide assistance. So that is all that I have for this afternoon. Thank you so much, Jay, as well as to the TAP team and all of our amazing attendees for today's webinar. Hope everyone has a great afternoon.